Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 20th of March. My name is Maggie Lennon, and to remind you that this is the official first day of spring. It's the spring equinox today, which means that the number of daylight hours equals the number of nighttime hours. It's also the day that you're meant to be able to balance an egg on its end. I wonder how many of you have tried that. I'll start with the coronavirus statistics for the last 7 days. In the past week, there have been 77,325 new COVID-19 cases confirmed. In the past week, there have been sadly 129 new deaths confirmed of people who have tested positive within 28 days. A total of 4,441,944 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. 4,173,678 have received their second dose, and 3,473,650 have received either a third dose or a booster. There were 2,050 people in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19 as of 2 o'clock yesterday, and 31 of them were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 11,098 patients in Scotland who tested positive have sadly died. And we should point out that the numbers of infections since the beginning of this month also includes reinfections. I'm joined down the line today from Dunbar by Paul McLennan MSP for East Lothian. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
Morning, Maggie. Not bad. Nice day. It feels first day of spring, so hopefully the good weather will continue.
It certainly does. I saw lots of snowdrops when I was out hill walking in the Borders yesterday. I'll start just with a quick run through of the update from Ukraine of things that have happened in the last 24 hours, and then we'll come back to some of these stories, Paul. Shockingly, residents of Mariupol have been forcibly taken to Russia, where they've been redirected to cities in the country, the Mariupol City Council has reported. The council said that several thousand Mariupol residents were deported to Russia, having been taken to filtration camps where occupiers check people's phones and documents. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russia's siege of Mariupol is a terror that will be remembered for centuries to come. To do this to a peaceful city is a terror that will be remembered for centuries to come, he said. He added that peace talks with Russia were needed, although they were not easy or pleasant. More than 6,600 Ukrainians were evacuated from besieged cities through 8 humanitarian corridors on Saturday, Zelensky has said. China's Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, says his country is on the right side of history as it continues to rail against sanctions imposed on Russia and deny that it is considering supplying weapons to Moscow. Zelensky has appealed to Switzerland to crack down on Russian oligarchs who he said are helping to wage war on Ukraine from the safety of beautiful Swiss towns. Your banks are where the money of the people who unleash this war lies. That is painful, he said, addressing an anti-war protest in Bern. Poland has proposed for the European Union to implement a total ban on trade with Russia. The Polish Prime Minister has said that Poland is proposing to add a trade blockade to the package of sanctions as soon as possible, including both of its seaports, but also a ban on land trade. The southern city of Zaporizhzhia, which is close to the nuclear power station which came under attack recently, has entered a 38-hour curfew beginning at 4 o'clock local time on Saturday, after the Ukrainian military ordered people to stay home until early on Monday. The city has become an important route for some of the 35,000 people estimated to have already escaped from the siege of Mariupol. Aid agencies are becoming prevented from reaching people trapped in Ukrainian cities surrounded by Russian forces, the World Food Programme has said. It's warned that Ukraine's food supply chains are breaking down, with many grocery stores and warehouses now empty. And Ukraine may not produce enough crops to export if this year's sowing season is disrupted by Russia's invasion, the presidential advisor Ole Ustenko has said. Russia said it had used hypersonic weapons which travel fast enough to evade detection by missile defense systems to destroy an underground military depot in western Ukraine. Its defense ministry said on Saturday it hit the depot for missiles and aircraft ammunition, and the Interfax news agency reported that the ministry said it had also destroyed Ukrainian military radio and reconnaissance centres near the port city of Odessa using a coastal missile system, according to Interfax. 10 humanitarian corridors were agreed with Russia for the evacuation of citizens, Deputy Prime Minister has said. Reuters reports that Vereshchuk had said that a corridor had been agreed for the besieged city of Mariupol, although the authorities' previous efforts to evacuate civilians there under a temporary ceasefire had mostly failed. Kyiv officials have reported that 228 people, including 4 children, have been killed in the capital. Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs reported that 14,400 Russian personnel have been killed since the start of the war. Zelensky has again called on meaningful and fair peace talks to take place urgently. He told Moscow that Russian losses would otherwise be so huge it would take generations to recover. Negotiations on peace, on security for us, for Ukraine, meaningful, fair, and without delay, are the only chance for Russia to reduce the damage from its own actions. The interesting thing about the war is it's taken a turn, Paul. It's no longer about the Russian army trying to move in and take large expanses of land. They're stalled pretty much. Not terribly sure why. Suggestion is they don't actually yet control all the airspace, but they seem to have gone for a new strategy, which is that they're just going to kind of, in a blitzkrieg sort of approach, indiscriminately bomb cities and towns, which obviously means that civilians are in the firing line more than they might have expected to be. Do you think that's a reasonable summation of how they've turned the war?
Yeah, I would, Maggie. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to be a military expert, but I think in seeing some of the analysis by military people in the last week or two, I think the Russians thought they would go into Ukraine, overrun the city, and put in a puppet government within days. We're now 4 weeks into this, and I think the Russian forces have made much slower progress than they thought they would, and I think we've seen this game plan in place before. When the Russians went into Syria and literally destroyed cities and affected, residents then. So it's deeply worrying. I think Putin's realised that he's not going to get this war over as soon as he thought he would, and he's reverting now to, I suppose, it's crude military tactics. I think, and it's affecting, deeply worrying that it's affecting residents rather than military now. So yeah, and as I said, we've seen this before. So it's in the Russian game book.
I mean, they're saying that Mariupol's effectively been wiped off the face of the earth. And it feels like if he's not going to be able to take Ukraine and have it as a satellite state of Russia, he doesn't really want anything to be left of Ukraine for them to be able to be a sovereign state of. That's what it feels like, although I'm sure at the end of the war there will be a huge effort by the West to help rebuild the country. But we are talking about literally rebuilding the country from the ground up. Although we should remind ourselves that Western Ukraine at this moment is still relatively free of the sorts of vicious damage that we've seen in the east and the south. But it does, as I say, mean that civilians are brought into this war much more than they might have expected to be. And I've asked several guests on the programme before, does that constitute a war crime, or is that just the collateral damage of this type of warfare?
No, I mean, I think it constitutes a war crime, and I think we've seen that. We in Dunbar, we know friends whose son and mother and father are in Kharkiv, and the stories that we're hearing from what's happening in Kharkiv is deeply worrying. Where I think Russian troops are just shooting indiscriminately at residents, and I think we've seen other examples, and I think probably where social media and technology is nowadays, I think that it's much easier to spot these crimes than they were years ago. But again, I think there's a real role for, I think, European governments, the US, and every government to look at to make sure that these aren't being missed. It takes me back to the Balkans, where there was literally concentration camps and movement of people then, and we didn't really know about these until after the Balkan War. So I think it's really incumbent on us to make sure that we're aware of everything that's going on, and everything's being picked up, and we're trying to bring these up with the Russians, even though at the moment they seem to be ignoring every humanitarian request. But we need to make sure that these are picked up. I think Putin will be brought to justice at some stage, but I think it's we have to continue to keep an eye on these humanitarian. I suppose the way it's being treated, it's ridiculous, and I think that there are war crimes, and I don't think Putin cares at the moment. But I think it will come back, and he will be brought to justice at some stage.
I think the really concerning thing is this announcement that thousands of people from Mariupol have been relocated to Russia. Now, if you remember, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, at the first discussion of humanitarian corridors, the Russians said, yes, we'll have humanitarian corridors, but they'll come to Russia. And people said, well, that's not really what we're looking for, and you can understand why. But you mentioned concentration camps there during the Bosnian War, and they're talking about putting people in filtration camps. It is maybe just a matter of semantics. But that has to be a huge concern, that people have been forcibly taken to another country. And obviously, most people didn't have a passport with them, didn't have time to pick up a passport, but we didn't have papers. So that becomes a further issue in the future. Do you think we'll see more of this, or do you think that's just a particular low point, or is that the plan in future? They will evacuate the cities that they take over or they destroy and take people to Russia?
I think Mariupol, obviously, with its closeness, its proximity to the Russian border, obviously lends itself to that position. Whether we'll see that, time will tell. I would hope not. I think there's a real role now, I think, for the UN in terms of this, in terms of peace monitors, to make sure, what are these camps really about. And as soon as you hear the word camp, it brings back, obviously, memories of the Second World War, and it obviously brings back other memories of, as I said, the most recent war in Europe, and that was obviously the Balkans one, where again we've seen concentration camps, and here we are in 2022, and we're talking about this again. It's deeply worrying. The UN need to be speaking to Russia and demanding to be in to see what these camps are all about, and independently monitor these. It's deeply worrying.
Yeah, there's been no discussion of that as far as we can ascertain. The Red Cross, for example, haven't been invited to be involved, and you're right, there does need to be a kind of independent eyes on this. You were talking about the fact that you think he'll be brought to justice. So would you support Gordon Brown's suggestion last week that there needs to be a sort of Nuremberg trial type follow up from this?
I'm not, again, where the European courts are and so on, and I think part of the discussion would be who would be the who would be the court he would be before, how would that look like, and of course, he first needs to be brought into justice. He's very heavily embedded into the Russian system just now. The only way I would see that is if from internal. If he was moved internally, I obviously couldn't see him coming of his own volition, and I think it would be very difficult for him to go on trial without him actually being there. So, yeah, I think we need he needs to be brought to some kind of justice. I'm not quite sure what that would look like and how that would look like, but we can't have a country doing what it's doing in 2022 and expecting to get away with humanitarian crimes that it's against people. It's bordering country. It can't be done, and I think there has to be a message goes out to Putin about that. This if he does this with Ukraine, where else could he do this with?
Yeah, well, that's it's the escalation that is the huge concern, and also the China's position on this is seemingly quite confused. So we reported last week that for the first time that we were aware of, they had actually reported on civilian deaths. It was the people who were killed while standing in a bread queue, and they had, I believe, referred to it as an attack as a result of the war. They used the word war, and we thought, oh, this is maybe quite good news. Maybe China are coming off message. Maybe they're being, they're no longer quite sitting on the fence. But it would appear from what's been said recently that they've taken great exception to being told or asked by President Biden, who had a call with the Prime Minister, who begged them not to send arms. And they've come out and said that nobody tells China what to do. China will do what it wants to do. And this rather chilling phrase that we're on the right side of history. So it appears that perhaps China are not coming off message. And the worrying thing there, of course, is they might be watching this very, very carefully to see how Ukraine plays out for Putin, because they might be thinking how that Taiwan might play out for them, because obviously that's where they're thinking of moving next. So how do you read China's views on what's been happening?
I think China's got a balanced act. I think strategically and in military terms, you're right. Taiwan, I think, has always been an objective for them to unify, as they say, to bring Taiwan back into the fold since the revolution. So I think whether they decide militarily, that would be something that they would go into. I'm not too sure. I think they've seen issues that the Russians have had. I think economically, I think there would be issues for them economically in terms of the markets they have in the West, and again, if sanctions were brought in against China, to almost even to a certain extent, I think the Chinese economy would suffer. So I think militarily they're trying to balance and show that toughness, I suppose, and that message out to Taiwan. I think economically they still have that balance. They know if they fully support the Russians by supplying arms and so on, I think they're in a position that they know that sanctions could have a major impact on their economy. But it's going to be an interesting one to see how this goes in the next month or two, where the conflict goes in the next month or two, and where China places itself. This is changing the geopolitical system in the world for a long time. And I think we'll wait to see where this evolves in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But it is
Well,
again worrying when the Chinese come out and say they're on the right side of history.
it has certainly changed the geopolitical landscape, and it's meant that European countries that don't often agree on very much are agreeing on a lot more. The kind of outsiders, Poland and Hungary, who really the EU have been kind of, I think, privately wishing might just disappear because they don't really necessarily adhere to all the European values, are now kind of the heroes of the hour, if you like. We've got Finland and Sweden contemplating joining NATO, which is something they never did, and Macron pushing for much closer links between the EU and NATO. That hasn't always been an easy relationship. So it does really seem to be, as you say, changing that. On a slightly more positive note, the scheme to allow Ukrainian refugees to come as sponsored people to live in people's homes has just opened. Scotland's taken a slightly different angle. It's promoting itself as a super sponsor, so that when people are applying for visas through the sponsorship programme, they can tick the box that says they want to come to Scotland. They don't need to have a family that they can announce in their application. The idea being when they get to Scotland, then they will be matched with people who put up their offers of housing a Ukrainian refugee for up to 6 months on the Homes for Ukrainian portal. I'm assuming that went through the Scottish Parliament without any dissenting voices, or were there dissenting voices?
No, I think there was no dissenting voices. I think that the thing that was obviously mentioned was obviously needed approval from the UK government. The UK government, I think, was incredibly slow in dealing with this right at the outset. Demanding passports, demanding families, and so on. And again, I think it's been indicative of this UK Tory government, and it's moving. It's not moving quick enough, and I think the Scottish government moved on to the super sponsor suggestion very quickly, and I'm proud that Scotland could lead the way in that. But as I said, I think there was unanimous support across that, but disappointment, I think, in the way that the UK government had to be pushed and cajoled into this to allow this to happen.
And I think Wales also were, certainly Drakeford was
Yeah.
discussing Wales becoming a super sponsor too. So it's interesting to see how the devolved administrations are treating this differently. The sponsorship scheme for refugees has existed for quite a long time. It's always been possible to sponsor refugees from camps. But the sponsorship scheme doesn't necessarily mean that people go and stay in someone's homes. It tends to be that consortiums of people get together, sponsor an individual, and negotiate with a local housing association or a local housing provider for accommodation. And people have to be self-sufficient, usually within 6 months to a year. This idea of people being put up in individual people's homes is obviously a very obvious and very physical sign of the outpouring of support for what's happening in Ukraine. But I think it's not without its concerns and not without its difficulties, not least to do with disclosure and PVGs, to make sure that the people who are offering their homes are people who are safe to be living with. I mean, there will be a lot of women on their own and women with children on their own, and you wouldn't be able to work with vulnerable people without a PVG scheme through Disclosure Scotland. Now, I understand they're in the mix of discussion, but these things often take quite a long time. So I'm just wondering if there's been any discussion about how that can be fast-tracked. Will it be fast-tracked? What safety measures will be put in place to make sure that people are genuinely safe when they arrive here?
Yeah, Maggie, I think the minister responsible for refugees, Neil Graham, touched on this and discussions he's had with colleagues. I mean, COSLA are obviously a major part of that. It's local authorities are. So there are discussions ongoing at the moment, obviously, around about how COSLA, Scottish Government, UK Government, and obviously organisations that arrange these placement with families are going on just now. So there is that degree of urgency that needs to be there. You're right. I mean, PVGs can take a number of weeks, and you're talking 6, 7, 8 weeks, which again, we're looking to host families as soon as possible. So I think they are looking at ways, obviously, to protect the safety, which is paramount. And people coming across from Ukraine who have suffered terrible consequences, but they need to be looked after properly over here. And you're right, the safety aspect needs to be there. But I know there's a great deal of work going into that just now in terms of that, just getting people housed as soon as possible, with host families as soon as possible, but obviously with safety and concern. So hopefully in the next week or two, I'm sure there'll be detailed processes in place to make sure that we get the best of both worlds, if you like, that we get people rehoused.
Obviously, this is not the first instance in recent memories in the last 6 or 7 years where there have been huge mass movements of people due to war. Obviously, the Syrians were the first, and the more recent people fleeing Afghanistan. At no point did the government here in Scotland or elsewhere in the UK suggest that it's about putting people up in people's homes. They've gone down the resettlement route, which is, if you like, a slightly cleaner route. Local authorities will give a certain number of houses. People get their own homes, they're resettled, and the local authorities are given a package of financial support to make sure that they have integration. And that integration can take, 3, 4, 5 years. And lots of agencies are involved. And in Scotland, all 32 local authorities signed up for the Syrian programme. All 32 local authorities have signed up for the Afghan programme, although the actual resettling is taking slightly longer. There's a feeling amongst those communities, and I say this as someone who works with refugees every day, there's a feeling amongst the Syrian and Afghan communities that somehow the Ukrainians are getting a better deal, and people are quite, I think, justifiably asking, is it because the Ukrainians are white and mostly Christian and European, so they're more like us, and they're not being treated in the same kind of way that a lot of refugees of colour are? Do you think that's a fair comment for them to make?
I think there's a couple of things. One, I think obviously the numbers we're talking about in terms of Ukrainian refugees is, could be quite substantial. I think that there is probably a degree into that around about, Syrian and Afghan refugees. I think we've seen examples around about how they're treated and how, I suppose some of the centres that they're kept in. So I would agree there would be a certain element of that, and that was, I suppose for me, there was that deep undercurrent that kind of worried me with the UK government reaction about, and again, this is not separating Ukrainian and Syrian and Afghan refugees, just around about how the UK is seen as a country that doesn't welcome refugees. In terms of Scotland, and I think with the super sponsor, I think we've shown we're willing to play a more active part. But you're right, Maggie. I think there's always been that element, when Afghan and Syrian refugees come across, there is that degree of everyday racism that people have to suffer. So I think there is that degree, and we have to be aware of that. But Scotland is a welcoming country, but no, we can't hide away from the fact there are people who have there's been racist incidents, as we know, and generally how some people are felt, how Syrians and Afghans are felt to be perceived in Scotland. It's we've had refugee issues, for hundreds of thousands of years. People have moved across and from different parts because of war. We need to be as welcoming as we possibly can. Nobody probably thought there would be a war break out in Ukraine.
Scotland itself does have a very strong record of that. It's understood across Europe as being an example of best practice for the integration of refugees. We have a national refugee strategy, which the rest of the UK doesn't have. One of the things that concerns me is there are thousands of Ukrainian fruit pickers and seasonal workers in the country who, although they're being allowed to stay till December apparently, are not, at the moment at least, involved in either of these two schemes, either the family reunion scheme or the sponsorship scheme. And it's not at all clear what's going to happen to them. They're allowed to stay till December, provided they're employed by the people who brought them over and doing the jobs that were brought over for. But as we said before, there's not much fruit picking in December. There's real concerns what happens to them. And I don't know if that's been discussed in the Scottish Parliament, but I think we might try and find out in the future if there's any movement on supporting them.
Funny enough, I mean, I had intended to raise this in the Parliament as a supplementary question, I think last week, to one of the ministers. I think it was Neil Gray at the time, and unfortunately run out of time. So I've submitted a written question, and it's asking that very reason, asking that very thing. So hopefully at some stage.
Well, when you get your answer, Paul, let us know.
Yeah, and I know in a quick discussion with him, the Scottish Government are aware of it, and it's an issue that they've raised with the UK Government. So we'll hopefully get some kind of satisfactory conclusion from that. But we are aware of it. Neil Gray, the Refugees Minister, is aware of that. He has raised with the UK Government, so hopefully we'll get a positive outcome with that. You're right, because it almost seems there's almost, when you look at the situation, we've had Ukrainian fruit farm workers, as you said, coming across, and we've had issues with Brexit, and then you have this situation. You think the UK government should be as welcoming as possible to Afghan refugees, particularly people whose families are over here, have been working over here, and just want to bring their families over here. It should be a simple yes in terms of that. Yeah, let's make sure it's as simple as possible. We'll wait and see what the UK government say. Based on what they've been so far, not overly convinced we'll get a positive outcome, but we'll continue to push for that.
Good. The big news story this week, closer to home, is the shocking announcement that 800 P&O workers were going to be dismissed immediately and replaced by cheaper workers, some working for as little as £1.38 an hour. I hear you say, how can people work for £1.38 an hour? That's so far below the minimum wage. The point is, of course, people who work offshore and work at sea are ruled by a whole raft of different legislations. It depends what flag your ship flies under. You can be held accountable to regulations in your port. You can have your contract regulated by the UK if you're employed as a UK worker. It's complicated. I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but the national minimum wage rules in the UK do not apply to people on international sea routes. And it's estimated that the move to replace these 800 workers by 800 cheap workers is going to cut P&O's bill in half. However, Paul, as we've been discussing this week on this programme, we have serious doubts about whether it's really about money. After all, the parent company is making billions in profit. Their shareholders are getting fat dividends. And we're wondering if it's not more to do with the fact that since Brexit, there is not nearly so much sea freight coming to the UK. There's an interesting map produced this week that shows the number of sea routes from the north of France that are skirting the UK and going straight to ports in the Republic of Ireland. So we're wondering if that's partly to do with it and nothing to do with the fact that they claim to be losing so much money, or if they are losing money, it's actually to do with Brexit. Now, obviously, this is an appalling attack on workers' rights. We know that the Conservative Party are not fans of workers' rights. Where do you see this leading? What do you think the role of the unions will be and can be? And is this a bit of a watershed moment for the trade union movement to try and prove that they still got some teeth?
Yeah, I think this is deeply worrying when 800 people getting sacked on a Zoom call was, and I think we've all seen the clip, was incredible, incredibly callous. You see the owners coming on and basically just saying, look, we're having issues, there's cash flow issues, and we're paying you off, and we're paying you off now, which was incredible. And obviously, we then seen at the same time they've got contract workers ready to come in and do these jobs. Now, I understand as well, in speaking to a couple of contract workers, they didn't know what they were coming in to do. So, whether that's true or not, I don't know. And a few, I think, then decided once they've heard that they would take a step back. It is deeply worrying. If P&O can do this, then other companies are looking, can they do the same? Because I think over the next number of months and years, we're going to see economic difficulties. If other companies think they could get away with this, then you said it could be a watershed. So I think the unions have to, stand up to see this. And yesterday, you seen yesterday, the local MP for Dover was at a protest. I don't know if you've seen that, and she was speaking and engaging with the unions. And the unions had obviously said that she hadn't voted against hire and refire. Voted for hire and refire, and they basically started saying shame on you to her, and she thought it was on the company, didn't realise it was on her. So I think Tory MPs need to stand up and be very strong about this. The Tory government needs to come out and stand up against this, because if P&O can do it, I think other companies will take these opportunities and almost do the same thing.
Yeah, because this fire and rehire loophole to redundancy law, there was to be a bill passed to outlaw it, but it was blocked. And it didn't happen. And there are people within the government who are denying that it was ever existed as a potential block. Because that's what confusing people, that they think, well, but there are rules about redundancies. You can't make people redundant and then immediately replace them. There have to be consultation periods and all the rest of it. But this does seem to be a loophole. But perhaps the most chilling thing that's come out is it's just broken, I think, today or maybe late last night, was that actually the UK government knew about this before the people being fired. P&O had told them. They had also sacked nearly 1,200 people in 2020. So this isn't the first wave of redundancies that they've made. but that the UK government knew specifically about these 800 job losses. It had circulated in an internal Westminster memo that had gone certainly to the Prime Minister's private office. It's certainly gone to the Transport Minister, so he knew about it. So it kind of makes this recent claim from the government of, oh dear, this is terrible, and we can't be having this, and we're going to look at their contracts and take their contracts away from them. So they knew about it, which makes them, I think, complicit. But also, what about the 50 billion, was it, or million? Can't remember exactly the figure, that P&O got in furlough payments.
Yeah.
To say nothing of the billions worth of actual publicly funded contracts they've picked up over the years. Is there any suggestion that they'll have to pay any of that money back? Is anyone holding the government to account for knowing about this?
Maggie, I totally agree. I mean, I've seen the article in the Guardian this morning, obviously, where the government have been accused of this. If they have been part of this, then and are complicit to this, that question has to be asked, and I'm sure SNP colleagues will be asking that in Westminster. It's something that we have to obviously ask in the Scottish Parliament as well, even though it's not something that we have control over, and again, there shows the shortcomings of employment law. It does affect obviously workers in Ryan and so on. So that I think that's something that needs to be asked. And if the government are complicit in this, they need to be bringing in legislation to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And as you said quite rightly, looking to see what public support that the P&O have had, whether it's been through furlough, and other contracts maybe they've had from UK government. That needs to be looked at, and it needs to be looked at this week very quickly. We can't allow companies to do that and then give them public money and public money that support them. It can't go on, and I think it's a watershed moment for employee relations, because again, if this happens, where do we go? These would be, you're going back to the days of Thatcher, I think, in terms of trade union law. If we allow this to happen, every company that have no morals will come in and do the exact same thing, and it's repugnant behaviour, I have to say. That you've got 800 people, 800 families who literally turn up to job one day and then they lose their job the following, later on that day without any notice whatsoever. It's terrible. It's disgusting. It can't be allowed. It can't be allowed. UK government has to be held to account on this. They've brought in legislation where you've seen legislation brought in very quickly for various things. They need to bring in legislation now to ban this process, because if not, I fear that you're going to see other companies will come in and do the exact same.
But given that Britain is desperate to bring trade to these shores by any means because of what it's lost during Brexit, they made it clear that one of their plans was to make employing workers so deregulated that it was going to make it easier. Now, although they did sign an agreement with the EU that said they had to hold to key fundamental EU provisions in employment law, I don't think redundancy was part of that. I think it was more about saying that they would make sure that the maximum 48-hour week couldn't be changed, whatever. But I don't know how long that agreement is for. And let's face it, Britain haven't been very good at honouring agreements recently, or honouring agreements in international law. They could, I guess, just rip that up and decide that actually it's a free-for-all in the UK. Anybody can come here, treat workers badly, pay them what the hell they want, and it's all very nice for business. I mean, somebody said to me, it doesn't matter whether it's legal or not, it was morally wrong. And I said, I'm not convinced that business and morality necessarily always goes together. Or am I being a bit harsh on business?
No, I think you're right. Coming back to the point that I just made in terms of if businesses watching this thinking if P&O can get off with it, they can do the exact same thing. And I think organisations such as CBI and Federation of Small Businesses and so on should be coming out very, very strongly against this and condemning it very, very quickly. And you're right. I mean, I think part of these issues that we've seen is the drop in trade after the UK left, obviously left the EU has been a major issue. But you've seen the points that the UK government were trying to make, almost trying to make it like a trying to bring industry in, with low tariffs, I suppose, with low regulation. But this is a step far too far. This is a step too far. This is a massive drop to the bottom. This is really scraping the bottom of the barrel. If we allow this, and as I said, I fear you'll see dozens, if not hundreds, of companies who have no morals looking to do this. And we need to make that very clear that this can't be allowed, not just morally, and of course it's morally wrong, but we need to legislate to make sure this can happen as
Yeah.
soon as possible. And the UK government should be pushed on that, and it'll be something I'll be raising with the Scottish government. So obviously they can raise with UK counterparts to say, because again, if they can do it with P&O, who's not to say, there's going to be other companies who are predominantly based in Scotland and doing that. So it's maybe P&O today, it's affected people obviously in Cairnryan. It could be affecting some companies who are solely based in Scotland, and we have no powers over that whatsoever. So, the Scottish government need to be raising this very quickly as well to make sure that this doesn't happen to companies that are Scotland, and it could be affecting thousands, if not tens of thousands, over the next number of months if we don't deal with this now.
Finance Secretary Kate Forbes has been busy this week. We're coming up to the spring announcement of the budget, the spring statement from the Chancellor, and she's written to Rishi Sunak this week ahead of the spring statement, calling on UK ministers to match the 6% up rate on social security benefits, which the Scottish Government is delivering on 8 of the benefits that it delivers, and for further payments to be made to low-income households through the cold weather payment. Now, we've been talking a lot about the cost of living increase. We know that it's a perfect storm. It's energy costs, it's food costs. There'll be food shortages possibly as a result of the war in the Ukraine. Energy costs could go up again. People whose jobs might be at risk. That's another issue. So we are meeting a perfect storm of cost of living increases. Obviously, Kate Forbes has to write this kind of letter to the Chancellor. But Paul, what the chances are of the Chancellor paying a blind bit of attention to it?
I think very unlikely. I watched him on telly this morning, and he was quizzed on cost of living. He still defended the national insurance hike, said it was needed for the NHS. And we'll wait and see what that happened before. We've all heard the £350 million a week Brexit promise, so we'll see what happens with that one. I think when you look at the figures about what's actually happening now, it's deeply worrying. There was a report out during the week about Scottish Government policies saying, it was the cumulative Scottish Government policies could make a difference for poorer families by around about 31%. I think that's despite the Scottish Government mitigating UK government policies by £600 million a year. In my own constituency, and I know this is shared right across Scotland, food bank usage in the last 3 months have gone up by 40%, 28%, and really worryingly, 54% year on year. That was for February. 54% increase. Now, the vast majority of people who use food banks are working poor. The people who work, and we're now seeing that issue, and this is before we see the energy costs go up. So you are literally going to see people. It's going to make a choice whether it's heat or eat. There are 15,000 people already in my constituency who are in fuel poverty. That number could easily double over the next month or two. So, I think we're at the very outset just now. People are talking about it. It's really going to start to hit in the next month or two. As I said, 54% increase year on year in food bank usage in my constituency is deeply worrying. Is deeply, deeply worrying. And I think, as you said, it's the perfect storm at the moment. I don't see Rishi Sunak making much of a difference as well. And it's not just, obviously we talk about residential. I've been speaking to a number of businesses over the last number of weeks as well who are deeply worried. I spoke to one business chap yesterday who has seen his costs in around about 8 or 9 months probably go up 4 times in terms of his energy, 4 times. So he's deeply worried about his business, as are lots of other people. So what we're going to have is obviously businesses that maybe go out of business, and we'll then see people who go into unemployment. So again, that's going to have an impact as well. So we need to be supporting business as well in terms of fuel costs. If we don't, I feel you'll see unemployment rise quite sharply because businesses can't afford the rise in energy.
Well, of all the things that Kate Forbes has written about, she has actually got a list of things for businesses. She wants more targeted funding to business sectors directly affected by the conflict in Ukraine. And I know that there's been a working group set up to look at food security and food shortages in the Scottish Parliament. She wants relief to business on national insurance contributions, removal of VAT from energy efficient and zero emission heat equipment, greater powers for the Scottish Government to work with employers to implement flexible working. Don't know what that means, to be honest, and full replacement of EU funding lost to Scotland as a result of Brexit, which was promised by the UK government. So she's clearly got the business community in her head. Do you know anything more about the food security plans that were announced last week?
And there was one prime example, Maggie, and this I visited last week with the Rural Affairs Cabinet Secretary. I visited a pig farm in my constituency, and the 70% of expenses in terms of pig farmers is feed, and some of that feed is grain and so on. Ukraine is a massive producer of grain, so and it's going to impact on that in the next number of months. And I think you touched on it at the top of the programme. If the farmers can't get in to plant this year and look after the crops, these crops are going to fail. It's obviously going to damage the Ukrainian economy massively, but the feed through to food security that we're looking at is going to mean that. So I know the farming sector are incredibly worried about this because obviously if the feed that comes through and the massive increases that they've seen in that sector. So yeah, I think the farming community welcome it. I know the discussions we had last week, just on Wednesday when we were talking about it, they are very concerned about it, and it's something we need to look at. This isn't going to be. I don't think this is just going to be something that we need to deal with in the next month or two. I think the fallout from the Ukrainian war, I think, is going to continue to be with us for a long number of years, and it's going to impact on the world economy. But certainly with the food security sector side of things, we need to be looking at that right now because there are going to be issues that are impacting us almost immediately, and they are now. They are now.
You were talking about things that the Scottish Government are trying to do to mitigate the worst of the cost of living. Obviously, we mentioned the 6% up rate from the 1st of April on the 8 benefits that we manage that came to us. They've also doubled the Scottish child payment from £10 a week for eligible children to £20 a week. And there's been a cost of living reduction on people in, I think, Band D and maybe other bands of their council tax, which has just hit for next year's council tax. Do you know if there's anything else, any other mitigating measures that the Scottish Government are looking at at all?
Not at the
Or is that
moment,
about
Maggie.
as
No,
far as they can go?
I think I know that the Scottish Government's looking at it just now, and I think obviously with Kate writing to the Chancellor, obviously she's asked for a few asks that we've seen in there. I'm aware that there are still discussions going, I think, at Cabinet and ministerial level in terms of what more can be done. So again, but our powers are limited in what we can do in that regard. But I know that that's been looked at the moment. So I would expect, hopefully, and again we've got to see, and again this is why we're talking about the need for independence. We have to wait and see what a UK government Chancellor says about what we can then come in and support. But as I said, for example, we mitigate for the bedroom tax. The universal credit uplift was cancelled. And if we're talking putting people into poverty, and that's that. Funny enough, since that was cancelled, we've seen these 3 massive increases I talked about in food bank usage. So we're at the beck and call of what the UK government says, and then we have to react afterwards. It's not the ideal position. It's not the ideal position. We should be in the same position to help our residents as in any other country. For example, when you look at France restricted the rise of energy costs to 4%. To 4%. Germany brought in a windfall tax and reduced that as well. So, this is about government policy. This could be a policy decision that UK government can make. We don't have the powers to do that. We don't have the powers to do that. And it was interesting enough during the week, Maggie, it was at FMQs when we seen Nicola Sturgeon actually challenge Anas Sarwar and say, right, let's write a joint letter today to the UK Chancellor asking him to devolve the powers about a windfall tax. Will he do it? And of course, couldn't answer it, didn't answer it. But if we had that ability, we would be doing that now. So again, it shows that the falls of the devolved settlement, the restrictions of the devolved settlement. We can't do what every other country has the power and ability to do.
And when you think about what Scotland could do with the money that it's spending on mitigating these cuts, if we didn't have to spend it on that. So that's our choice to do that because it's the right thing to do. But if you think what else could happen with that money, I think often, certainly, the opposition choose to forget that, or maybe they
that
choose
point
to
is
ignore
raised in
it.
the Parliament time after time after time, Maggie, and it's never answered. It's never ever answered. The silence you hear, especially from the Tory benches, when about universal credit cuts, was incredible, absolutely incredible. So and that will continue. And it has been continued. About support for energy costs. That's been raised in the Parliament again. Deafening silence from the Tory benches.
In amongst all the bad news, there has been a little bit more good news this week, at least for the Ratcliffe family. Nanzani Zaghari Ratcliffe, the Iranian who was held for 6 years in Iran under false accusations that she was spying, was finally let home to the UK. The catalogue of disaster and incompetence shown by the British government and the Foreign Office in particular over these 6 years has undoubtedly contributed to the woman's incarceration. Her family were told within the first 30 days of her being captured by the Iranians that they should stay quiet and say nothing about it publicly. That was despite the fact that at that particular time, the Foreign Office didn't even know where she was. Her husband, however, decided that wasn't the way to play it, that he would go public and he would make the public aware and the people of the world aware of her plight. And certainly it's his view and her view and the view of several senior diplomats and some politicians that by not staying silent, he probably saved her life because Iran couldn't just quietly dispose of her. One of the things about the case that was perhaps the most famous was, amongst all the incompetent foreign secretaries who've been involved with it, was when Boris Johnson was foreign secretary. And he came out and said that as far as he knew, she was simply in Iran teaching people about journalism. And the Iranians clutched onto that immediately and said that was proof of her spying. The question has often been asked of him, did he know what he was saying? Or was it just another typical Boris blunder? We know that Boris's blunders are never just off the cuff. They've always got something else behind them. So what did you think about Boris's blunder in that particular case? What was he trying to actually do? He wasn't really trying to help her. Was he trying to appease the Iranians, or is the man just an idiot?
I think he's totally inept, and I think it wasn't the only case when he was foreign secretary. I think there was I think there was the documentary. I think it was on Channel 4, and it showed him in his time as foreign secretary, and I think there was sources to the Foreign Office basically just saying they had to look after him every single time he went on visits. He was totally inept. It's well known he has no grasp of detail, and I think obviously coming out and saying what he thought would help was the exact opposite. But I think I think in terms of this case, I think he was just totally inept, and it's continued in any office he's had and as prime minister. So yeah, I didn't think it helped, but it's his total ineptitude, I think, that really contributed to her staying there a lot longer than she really should have. And the other key thing I think for Maggie, for me as well, was what we didn't hear over a long period of time. There was this, obviously involved in this as well, was a long time debt that the UK needed to pay to Iran. That wasn't reported over a period of time. £400 million.
400 million debt, and it was for a cancelled arms deal.
Yeah.
And the
Going back to
Iranians
the 70s.
the Iranians never hid the fact. They said that they did take quite a lot of hostages, and that was the plan. That you renege on a deal and you owe us money. We'll take hostages of your citizens. They'd always made that clear. And yet, despite that, 3 prime ministers and 4 foreign secretaries refused categorically to accept that link whatsoever, despite the fact there was evidence of it. So, what made Liz Truss pay the money and get her back? What was really behind that? Is it just a sudden outpouring of compassion for this Iranian British woman to come back to her family, or what was there something else going on in the background? Given with present company accepted, Paul, not very trustworthy of politicians generally.
No, and there are a couple of things I think for me. One, I think we just can't accept this and how it happened. I think there needs to be some kind of inquiry. I know that would need to be held by Westminster, but there needs to be some kind of inquiry into that. Now, I know they can't go into every single detail because there'll be some issues around about that I suppose will be sensitive. But we have to look at this, and there has to be. I suppose that the Defence Committee down in the UK government needs to look at this in terms of why did this take so long? Why did it happen? Why was the debt outstanding for that period of time? So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, with Liz Truss, I think you've seen this very much, I suppose, touted in the press for 3 or 4 days before that. So you almost knew this was going to happen. So there was obviously the press element to that. I think when it comes down to Liz Truss is as inept, or even more so than Boris Johnson when it comes into this position. Some of her statements around about the war in Russia and in Ukraine have been incredible. She's so out of depth. So was there an element of politics and posturing? I think there was in terms of this, and it's maybe something that the UK government were looking for a good news story. with something they could have sorted out many, many months, if not years ago. And I think we've seen that with her husband. Just her husband, and he's been saying for years the UK government could have had this sorted out easily, incredibly easily, and they chose not to. I think they've chosen it to try and get the publicity out, and it's great. First and foremost, it's great to see her home and get her reunited with her family.
It is wonderful, but it's a long time to have been separated. And I was very struck by the reunion with her daughter. And although Nanzani threw her arms around her daughter really looked shell-shocked, and she doesn't know who the woman is. Is that mummy? She said as she saw her come down the steps. And they'll never that gap of time will be very difficult for the family to make up, and is
you
absolutely
can think
appalling.
about that with your own family, Maggie.
Exactly.
That's a heartbreaking thing that she'll never get back. For 6 years, I couldn't imagine that with my own son or daughter not seeing them for 6 years. It would be, it's a massive part of your.
And I think the other thing is there's a suggestion, of course, that Liz Truss has got her eye on a bigger prize. Now, as you say, she has been shown to be extremely out of her depth as Foreign Secretary. Her appointment was met in a number of areas by raised eyebrows. And it's maybe too far to say this was just a good photo op, but I think certainly she's going to be filing this one away in her "look what I've done well" box if she's thinking about going further. And again, that is really quite disgusting that people's livelihoods and lives and family reunion is tied into such political manoeuvring. It leaves a pretty bad taste in the mouth.
Yeah, and you're right, because I think the two favourites to replace Boris Johnson would probably be Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, and that's a frightening prospect on its own. But she's obviously trying to position herself in that regard, and you're right. I think she's seen this as an opportunity, and I think it's been well discussed, and sources down in Westminster have said that that from right across the political spectrum say that she is positioning herself for a tout at the premiership at some stage. And again, that's an incredibly worrying prospect, I'll have to say.
Well, we've just been talking about Boris's incompetence, and again, he's come out again and at the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool, he linked the freedom that Brexit voters wanted with the freedom that Ukrainians are fighting for and dying for on the streets of Ukrainian cities. Now, he has been vilified and criticised heavily for this from all sides of the political sphere. A lot of people in his own party, although the Chancellor, interestingly, this morning was still defending him and saying he wasn't conflating the two and saying that they were equal. But really, to try and suggest that there is anything similar between exercising your democratic right to vote in a referendum and taking up arms and defending your homeland from an invading army and dying for it is in the worst taste, would you think, Paul?
Yeah, I found it incredible when he came out and said that. And of course he's conflating the two. If you watch his speech, there's no other, it was very clear what he was saying. He was openly comparing the struggle for what the Ukrainians have had defending their own country, their democratically elected own country, with Brexit, which I find absolutely incredible. And we talked about his ineptitude, and I think there was an element of that. But if you're talking around about the man's judgment and his morality, trying to compare what happened with Brexit to what's happening in Ukraine is incredible, absolutely incredible. And he makes blunder after blunder after blunder. But his morality in this, as we've seen during the COVID issues, is incredible. Trying to compare the two. But
he almost can't help himself. He almost can't help dumbing down, and he almost can't help himself going for the populist message. And he was clearly playing to the Brexit stand, wasn't he? He was giving a nod to them, because I think he's going to come in under sticky waters with pro-Brexit people who, despite the fact he said people voted Brexit not because they didn't like foreigners, quite a lot of people voted for Brexit because they didn't like foreigners in actual fact. The large number of Ukrainians who may come to the UK, although it's still not clear how many it will be because of the bureaucracy, etc., who are going to be here for up to 3 years and given right to work, as they are absolutely entitled to, that could be a difficult one to sell to some people who wanted us out of Brexit because they were sick of, particularly Eastern European, although Ukraine are not in the EU yet, coming over for jobs. And I'm wondering whether he's just maybe aware of that and he's trying to keep the Brexit team on side for now, because I could see this coming back to be an issue a year down the line.
Yeah, I would agree. He's not just come out and said that. He's obviously thought around about why he would say it. What strategic message does he hope to get across? And I think you're right. I think there's an element that the very strong message that came through during Brexit was there was that soft xenophobic message, if you like. That they didn't want people coming across to work from, particularly around about Eastern Europe. That was a message that came across from some areas in regarding that. What he said, and what he said in regards to comparing Brexit to Ukraine, that would be one part of it. What else he tries to get out of that, I'm not sure. Is he trying to limit the number of people he thinks who would come from Ukraine at this moment? Because is it deliberately sending a message that the UK isn't welcoming? I think there was an element of that, and I think when you've seen the UK government's response to the refugee crisis at the outset, you've seen Ireland, for example. Its message it sent out very, very strongly compared with the message that came out from the UK, and I think that's part of the message that Boris Johnson's trying to send out and saying, it's almost a very low level. We'll take some refugees, but not too many. Thanks very much. And that seems to be the message of the UK coming across. And I think that's a wider context of what he said. He's trying to compare the Brexit with Ukraine. It's incredible that he comes out and says that, and it's crass. And if you're saying that to families, who live in the UK, who have got families in Ukraine, I would find that deeply offensive. I find it deeply offensive as it is. But if you've got family over there and comparing it to Brexit, sorry,
it is deeply offensive. Someone said on this, I think it was this morning, I can't remember who it was, said he was less Winston Churchill and more Basil Fawlty, which I thought was quite accurate.
Very much.
It's like the British government like to give with one hand and then whip it back with another in a way. And so all the things that he said about helping Ukraine have been kind of undermined by that one comment, just as all the things they said about how dreadful it was for the P&O workers have been completely undermined when it's now come out that the government knew about this all along. That's all we have time for today. I will close the show by reminding you that not only is it Spring Equinox Day today, it's also Census Day. So if you haven't filled in your census form, you should have had a letter with your code on it. Please do so. It doesn't take very long. I did mine on my phone. It took about 10 minutes. It's important because if we don't know what people are needing and wanting and how they're living their lives, then it's difficult for public services to be properly shaped. And it has been delayed. It should have happened last year, but because of the pandemic, it was put back a year. So please, if you haven't filled in your census form, go and find that letter with the number on it and fill it in. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you continue to have a spring-like day in East Lothian and away and cut your grass.
Well, I'll consider that, Maggie. I think it certainly looks going to be a nice day. So yeah, maybe cut the grass later on.
Good. And the rest of you, remember, try and balance an egg on its end. It's spring equinox. It's meant to work. Thank you. I'll be back on Tuesday with Scotland in 7. Have a pleasant afternoon. Goodbye.